The Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster is the most famous nuclear accident in human history. The disaster took place in the early hours of April 26, 1986, in northern Ukraine. What should have been a routine test went horrifically wrong, leading to 2 blasts which sent radioactive matter across much of Europe. Dozens of people lost their lives in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, but the true number of people affected remains a mystery. Since 1986, the disaster has been analyzed by scientists from around the world, but there's always been a level of secrecy surrounding the event, which happened behind the Iron Curtain. Even today, some aspects of the catastrophe remain mysterious or shrouded by conspiracy theories. Number 10. In the days after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, a group of Soviet Tu-16 aircraft flew over areas just north of the destroyed power plant. Their mission was essential, but they were not there to help with the cleanup mission. For decades, the work of these pilots remained top secret, and the devastating consequences of Operation Cyclone remained unknown, even to the people directly affected. The timing of the Chernobyl disaster couldn't have been worse for the Soviet authorities. During the Cold War, traditional May Day celebrations became a display of power. Military parades would take place in key places around the Union, including Ukraine's capital of Kiev and Moscow. Moscow was of particular importance. Countless people would gather in Red Square, along with Soviet officials, to celebrate the day. Moscow is roughly 700 kilometers northeast of Chernobyl and should have been far out of the danger zone. The exclusion zone around the plant was only 30 kilometers, but increased radiation spread further than this. At the time of the incident, wind and weather patterns sent most of the radioactive material to the northwest, away from Moscow. But shortly afterwards, the winds began to shift. High levels of radioactive material were now being blown towards Moscow, where millions of people would be gathered for the May Day celebrations. The government did not want to cancel these May Day celebrations. It was trying to downplay the seriousness of the disaster. Canceling the celebrations would make it obvious that something was very wrong, and the Soviet Union couldn't cope with it. Even in Ukraine, the Kiev celebrations went ahead as planned. But going ahead with the Moscow parades would put countless lives in danger, including the lives of top government officials. To make matters worse, a cold front was building in the area. When the clouds of fallout from Chernobyl reached this new weather front, rain clouds would develop. This could not happen. A plan was developed to use relatively new technology to stop the clouds in their tracks. Cloud seeding was not unheard of. It had first been theorized in the 1800s, and the methods had been worked out in the 1940s. Over the decades, it was developed and refined. By 1986, the main method of seeding rain clouds was through silver iodine and dry ice. This was dispersed in the air where clouds were wanted, cooling the water vapor in the air to allow clouds to form. The squadron of Tu-16 aircraft was sent to Belarus with charges of silver iodine. These were released over low population areas to the northeast of the plant, in the tracks of the radioactive material. People in the villages reported seeing the planes, flying with strange colored gas behind them. Shortly after, the rain clouds gathered. These released black rain onto the villagers and towns. The residents didn't know it at the time, but the entire area was being washed with radioactive water. Moscow had been saved, but it had cost the health of hundreds of thousands of Belarusians. They were not informed of what was happening, and there was no way of knowing the danger of the rain. The regions where the rain had fallen were as radioactive as parts of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, but people continued to live and farm in the area well into the 1990s. Scientists tried to warn people about what had happened, but they were ejected from the area. Years later, some of the pilots who had flown in Operation Cyclone were given medals for their bravery. They spoke out about what had happened, revealing the truth, but official acknowledgement of what happened still has not come. The full extent of just how much damage was done remains a mystery. Number 9. Chernobyl wasn't only home to the nuclear power plant. Hidden in an underground bunker nearby was the Chernobyl Anti-Aircraft Battalion, designed to help protect the Soviet Union if the Cold War became hot. 70 men were stationed here, along with 30 weapons. The fate of these men became a secret that was never officially acknowledged. Lieutenant Colonel Viktor Chershnev was the deputy commander and the chief engineer of the Kiev Air Defense Brigade, which was based at Chernobyl. The facility included the barracks where the company stayed, as well as the over-the-horizon early warning radar station, which was nicknamed the Woodpecker. Also housed at Chernobyl were missiles, 3 of which were tipped with nuclear warheads. After the meltdown at the power plant, items of all kinds were left behind in the exclusion zone. Photos from Chernobyl show rotting dolls, rusting medical equipment, and the rides of an amusement park that would never open. But even though the base was well within the exclusion zone, the valuable weapons stored there would not be left behind. It was a few days before any orders were sent to the military base. While the rest of the area was being evacuated, Chernobyl and his men had to wait to see what was to be done. 3 days after the catastrophic events of April 26th, they were finally given orders. The weapons were to be loaded onto military trucks and driven over 100 miles away to another military base in Boryspil. These trucks were not specifically designed to deal with the intense radiation that all the soldiers were experiencing, and there was nothing to stop the radioactive material coating them from being deposited along the roads between Chernobyl and Boryspil. Everyone on the mission knew that this was dangerous for their health, but they had little choice and went ahead anyway. The trucks barely reached 20 miles an hour along the journey, leaving plenty of time for unsuspecting civilians to be exposed to radiation. The convoy traveled through the heart of Kiev at night, as there was no other way to Boryspil by road. When the trucks arrived, the weapons were unloaded and left at the base, but the work wasn't finished. The new orders were to return and collect as much military equipment as possible. Multiple trips were made, with all the radioactive equipment being kept in facilities which weren't designed to house it. After this top-secret mission was complete, the soldiers attempted to scrub clean the trucks. This made little impact on the radioactivity, and likely only served to expose the soldiers to the dangerous conditions for longer. It was 3 years before officials visited the Boryspil site to inspect the contaminated weapons. These were considered so valuable that 70 men had risked their lives to bring them out of the exclusion zone, and many more had been working alongside them for years. But the officials discovered that the weapons and equipment were still too radioactive to be used. Chernobyl was told to get rid of them. The trucks that had been part of this top-secret mission were driven back into the exclusion zone, where they were abandoned with other vehicles and machines that had been used in the cleanup. But in an interview decades after the disaster, Chernobyl pointed out that the mission hadn't saved any lives or been part of any cleanup activity. Most of the men who were part of the mission suffered from severe health problems due to the exposure, and many wouldn't live long afterwards. When Chernobyl came forward with his story in 2019, the Russian government still didn't acknowledge that the mission ever took place. Number 8. The area of the Chernobyl exclusion zone has become known as a place where nature has reclaimed. But something is growing in the heart of the radioactive wasteland that scientists cannot explain. Ever since scientists started to experiment with nuclear technology, there have been theories about organisms that may thrive in radioactive environments. Extremophiles are found in the most unusual places on the planet. Normally, these come in the form of bacteria that thrive in places like the mouth of underwater volcanoes, where the mix of chemicals is too much for any other life to survive. There are organisms adapted to extreme heat or cold and to high levels of salinity. Scientists speculated that something could possibly adapt to high levels of radiation, even if it seemed like this environment was extremely hazardous to all known forms of life. It wasn't until the aftermath of the Chernobyl meltdown that scientists got the first indication that these radioactive extremophiles existed. While exploring the insides of what remains of reactor number 4, scientists found a strange type of black fungi growing on the walls. Black fungi were found in and around the nuclear power plant. Some were collected, and since then, many experiments have taken place. At first, it was thought the fungi were just making use of what was available. The organisms had found themselves in this highly radioactive environment and had to adapt to survive. It was thought that if the fungi were placed in a more typical environment, they would grow like normal. But this wasn't the case. The fungi hadn't just adapted to grow in this extreme environment, but depended on this radioactive environment to survive. These were radiotrophic fungi. The organisms would grow towards radioactive sources in a similar way to how plants grow towards light. What's more, they seemed to use radioactive material to grow. Scientists had speculated about a process called radiosynthesis for decades, but now it seemed to have been proven true. These fungi could use radioactive energy for metabolism, which explains why they needed radioactive material to survive. The precise process for this remains a mystery. Scientists know that melanin plays an important role in the process, though. Melanin is known for protecting organisms from UV radiation. These radiotropic fungi have extremely high levels of melanin, but the molecules don't just protect the fungi from the dangerous radiation. It seems as if the molecules are used in some way to transfer that radiation into chemical energy that the fungi can then use to grow. One theory is that the process is similar to photosynthesis. In that reaction, chlorophyll helps plants to convert light into chemical energy. Theoretically, something similar could happen with melanin and radiation, but the process could also be more complicated, with several separate stages. Research into these strange and mysterious fungi is ongoing, but scientists have already suggested many applications for these organisms. Number 7. The Russian woodpecker is an installation that was shrouded in mystery and conspiracy theories long before the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. After the incident, it would become one entwined in another conspiracy theory, this one suggesting that the entire meltdown had all been a cover-up by Soviet government officials. The Russian woodpecker is a nickname given to an early warning radar system located at Chernobyl. It was created in the mid-1970s and had the official name of Duga, meaning arc, and was designed to detect missile launches from the United States or its allies. The array of receivers was 700 meters long and 150 meters tall, but sat in the shadow of the nuclear power plant. In the West, the first anybody heard of this system was a strange tapping sound that interfered with radio broadcasts. This earned the system the nickname the Russian woodpecker. Radio enthusiasts were able to triangulate its location to Chernobyl, but there was no information about what the woodpecker actually was. This quickly gave rise to conspiracy theories. The knocking sound was supposed to be some kind of mind control, either to change the public opinion about the Soviets or to turn them into mindless zombies. In reality, the system was supposed to be nothing more than a warning device. It was not successful, though. Even amateur radio enthusiasts could block the woodpecker, and it's likely that military radio operators had a more sophisticated way to interfere with the signals. As the Soviet government began to launch satellites into orbit, over-the-horizon radars like the woodpecker became obsolete. Even installations far from Chernobyl were put out of service, and the woodpecker became a thing of the past. But according to some conspiracy theorists, the purpose of the Russian woodpecker wasn't the only secret being told. The theory was championed by Ukrainian artist Fedor Alexandrovich, who starred in a documentary called The Russian Woodpecker. He'd previously lived in the shadow of the nuclear power plant and was just 4 years old when the disaster happened. According to Alexandrovich and believers of the theory, Chernobyl was deliberately destroyed to hide the woodpecker's failure. Its creator knew that the woodpecker wasn't fit for purpose. There was an inspection due to take place in 1986, and it was impossible to hide this failure. To make sure this inspection didn't happen, they ordered the Chernobyl test to go ahead, knowing how dangerous it was. The theory doesn't go as far as to say he deliberately forced the meltdown, but he was aware that it was a likely possibility. After the disaster, there was no way for any inspection of the woodpecker to take place, and the secret of its failure could last a little longer. Of course, this was all just a conspiracy theory. The theory is something even the documentary makers didn't believe. There is some truth to it, though. Government officials in Moscow did put people of other Soviet republics at risk to keep themselves safe, and this happened with Operation Cyclone. But the problem with this theory in particular is that the Chernobyl disaster highlighted the failing Soviet infrastructure far more than the failure of the woodpecker ever would. Number 6. In the forest surrounding the nuclear power plant is a graveyard of machines that were used to try to contain the radioactive contamination from the Chernobyl disaster. These include robots and vehicles, but also some more unusual artifacts. Hidden far off the beaten path is a giant crane claw, resting in the forest and serving as an unofficial monument to the dangerous work liquidators undertook. The Chernobyl disaster started with a steam blast that caused extensive damage to Reactor 4's building. The roof of the building was torn open, and material from the reactor was pushed out. Graphite rods are used in nuclear reactors to control the reaction speed and absorb a lot of radioactivity. After the eruption, the rods from Reactor 4 were left scattered on what remained of the roof and on the roofs of surrounding buildings. These were some of the most radioactive places on the planet in the immediate aftermath. Cleaning up the roofs were essential, but extremely dangerous to liquidators. In an effort to try to minimize the danger, a crane was used to push the rods and most of the radioactive material back into the reactor building so that it could be sealed shut. The claw was used for this purpose. With every scoop of debris, the claw became more and more contaminated. By the end of its use, it was almost as radioactive as the material it had been cleaning up. Considering just how radioactive it was, the claw couldn't be buried. This risked contaminating the soil and water even more. So workers took the claw to an extremely remote part of the forest and left it there. This radioactive machine went relatively unnoticed for decades, but in 2019, an Australian archaeologist drew attention to this strange relic. Rob Maxwell was conducting research in the forest and on a private tour when he was taken to the claw. He was amazed to discover that it wasn't roped off and there was nothing physically stopping anybody from going to visit it. When he used a Geiger counter to assess the danger, he discovered that the radioactivity was hundreds of times higher than normal levels. At the time, news reports on the claw suggested that just touching this machine could cost someone their life. Since then, the claw has become part of some tours in the Chernobyl region. Visiting it isn't quite as dangerous as the initial news stories would suggest. It would take over a day of prolonged contact to do any lasting damage. More recent photos of the claw show tourists sitting inside of it, and it's been spray painted at some point. But even if it isn't quite as dangerous as was initially believed, the claw is still a reminder of the extreme dangers that the liquidators faced, and the ongoing question of just what should be done about the contaminated machines that were left behind after the cleanup. Number 5. There are many conspiracy theories that concern the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, but one of the strangest suggests that it may not have been entirely a man-made disaster. Just 10 years after the meltdown, a scientist suggested that a much more natural cause may have been the trigger behind this horrifying incident. In a paper published in 1996, an article suggested that an earthquake was detected shortly before the meltdown. The paper suggested that the Chernobyl nuclear power plant didn't have the correct precautions in place to stop even a minor earthquake from affecting the plant. It was this quake that supposedly led to the catastrophe. Shortly after the paper was published, other scientists pointed out the factual errors in the work. There were as many as 80 errors, and the seismograms were nothing more than hand-drawn illustrations. 3 seismometer stations had detected shaking on the night of the accident, but this corresponded to the accident itself. A year later, another group of researchers returned to the earthquake theory. This time, the researchers went into more detail and determined that there may have been a small earthquake, roughly 10 to 15 kilometers away from the power plant, which occurred just seconds before the disaster. The scientist even claimed that witnesses at the plant had reported some shaking and suggested that the earthquake may have been strong enough to be felt. One key part of the disaster concerned control rods that were inserted into Reactor 4. When the reaction seemed to be growing out of control, these rods were inserted. The intention was to displace water to slow the reaction, but the tips of these rods were made of graphite, which increased the reaction. This wouldn't have been a problem if the rods were fully inserted, but for some reason, the rods were only partially inserted. The reaction increased, rapidly leading to the famous meltdown. Some proponents of the earthquake theory suggest that the minor shaking could have been responsible for the malfunction. Just shifting the mechanisms of the rods over a small distance could have caused things to not line up perfectly. In some ways, the earthquake theory still places the blame for the disaster on the design of the power plant. Something as delicate as a nuclear power plant should have been protected against seismic activity. but it still suggests that the disaster wouldn't have happened without this natural trigger. Number 4. Liquidators was the name given to the workers who risked their lives to try to contain the damage done by the Chernobyl disaster. This includes the firefighters and plant staff who were on site immediately after the incident, as well as those who arrived later to seal what remained of Reactor 4 away from the outside world. Many of these people suffered lifelong illnesses due to the radiation, with some passing away not long after the disaster. It quickly became obvious that the cleanup teams would need a way to access the contaminated areas without physically going there themselves. Robots were the obvious answer. These machines could theoretically move rubble, test radiation levels, and record footage of the destroyed corridors and rooms of the reactor building. The Soviet Union had sent robots to the moon and probes to Venus, so it didn't seem like it would be too difficult for robots to navigate this more terrestrial danger. One of the first machines used in the cleanup effort was an adapted Soviet lunar rover, the STR-1. Others were robots that had been specifically designed for nuclear work and should have been able to withstand the radiation. But none of these had been tested in an environment like Chernobyl before. The high levels of radiation damaged components of the machines and made radio communications extremely difficult. The rubble provided an additional challenge. Some robots may have been able to work on flat terrain, but they couldn't overcome the obstacle of fallen debris and rubble. Often, humans in lead-lined suits would have to rush in to free the robots when they became stuck. Not long after the accident, scientists at Kurchatov's Institute Complex expedition were tasked with trying to solve this problem. They played a key role in the exploration of Reactor 4 in the first 5 years after the disaster, and were often the first people to come across new problems in the unprecedented disaster. The first machine that scientists found that actually helped their research was not something high-tech that could work on the moon. According to scientist Alexander Borovoy, it was a small toy tank. Borovoy wrote about the toy in his book about the Chernobyl disaster, published decades after the disaster. It had been purchased for 14 rubles at a toy shop in Kiev. The machine had tracks, which helped it navigate over difficult terrain, and could be controlled by a remote control connected by a short wire. The book contained a photograph of the small machine, but it seemed to be too strange to be true. Research done by the Chernobyl Family YouTube channel showed that it had actually been a Toy Planet rover, created by a company that specializes in space and military systems. The small toy was supposed to look like something that could navigate extraterrestrial worlds. It was actually better at navigating the disaster site than the lunar rovers that would have inspired it. Scientists adapted the small toy to fit various measuring devices, and it was then sent into the unexplored areas of Unit 4. Not only was the tank able to do the job, but the machines could also be decontaminated fairly easily. This was another issue that held back other machines. For about a year, the small machine went on many reconnaissance missions into the mysterious out-of-reach areas of the plant. In the meantime, there was a race for more high-tech and specialized robots to be built in other parts of the Soviet Union. In the spring of 1987, the small toy was retired and buried inside the power plant. All that's left is a few photos, a short video clip, and a recreation by the Chernobyl family. Number 3. The official analysis of the events of the Chernobyl disaster state that there were 2 blasts which together destroyed Reactor 4 and sent radioactive particles across large parts of Europe. The first was a steam eruption, caused by steam being put under intense pressure. A second blast occurred a few seconds later. This was due to hydrogen burning when it made contact with the oxygen in the air. Although the incident was a nuclear meltdown, there was no nuclear blast specifically, according to the official story. If that had happened, things would likely have been much worse. But more recent analysis has led some scientists to question that conclusion. It starts with a strange blue flash seen in the moments between the first and second blasts. Fishermen, located about 500 meters from the power plant, reported seeing a strange blue flash in the sky over the reactor after the first eruption. The second blast came just moments later. They had no idea what was going on, but would have known that it was something bad. What exactly caused this strange blue light is a mystery. Some have brushed off the light as something referred to as the Cherenkov radiation, but this wouldn't line up with the available information. Cherenkov radiation occurs when particles move faster than light. Nothing can move faster than the speed of light in a vacuum, but light can be slowed down in various other mediums, such as water. Not all particles are affected in the same way, which means that some can pass through water faster than light is able to. When this happens, the water appears to emit a blue light or glow. This can happen when a nuclear reaction happens in water, but this obviously wasn't what the fishermen saw on the night of the Chernobyl disaster. A more likely explanation is that the blue light was caused by the air being ionized. Atoms in the atmosphere were gaining or losing electrons. This releases a small amount of energy that causes the air to glow blue. The problem with this theory is that this shouldn't have occurred until after radioactive material was sent into the atmosphere. It should have happened after the second blast, rather than between the two. Scientists also pointed to other strange evidence. Radioactive particles were detected in Chernobyl 4 days after the accident. This is a region north of Moscow and should have been far out of the path that the radioactive material was taking. The particles could only have reached this region if they'd been sent much higher into the atmosphere. Based on this information and the damage at the reactor itself, scientists concluded that the fire blast at Chernobyl on April 26 of 1986 had actually been a thermoneutron-mediated nuclear blast. The steam eruption actually came second. This theory still hasn't been proven, and for now the official explanation of a steam blast followed by a hydrogen blast remains the accepted version of events. But that still leaves people questioning what exactly the blue flash scene actually was, and just how much of the story remains a mystery. Number 2. The actual number of people whose health was affected by the Chernobyl disaster still remains a mystery over 30 years later. But humans weren't the only things living in the region. Countless dogs, cats, and family pets were left behind in the exclusion zone when evacuations took place, as their owners believed that they'd only be away for a short period of time. An even greater number of cows, sheep, and other livestock were also affected. Ukraine was the Soviet Union's breadbasket. Food produced here would be shipped all over the USSR. In the mid-1980s, there wasn't a great deal of food stability in many parts of the Union, and much of the food they did have came from Ukraine. So the problem of what to do with contaminated produce became a crucial issue to solve. Unfortunately, it wasn't one that officials had an answer to. Hundreds of thousands of animals have been contaminated with the radioactive dust. If all that meat was destroyed, there would definitely be food shortages. On top of the desire to keep people fed, it would make keeping the extent of the disaster a secret all the more difficult. But letting the meat be sold like normal also wasn't an option. Officials came up with a simple plan to solve the disturbing problem. All the livestock in the affected region would be sent to meat processing facilities. There, the radiation levels were tested, and the meat was graded as low, medium, or high. Meat with low or medium levels of radiation would be mixed with so-called clean meat and turned into sausages. These were then shipped around the USSR, but with strict warnings not to send any to Moscow or Leningrad. This itself was difficult. The processing facilities weren't ready for the huge amount of meat that was coming from the contaminated fields. Teachers were rapidly trained to inspect the radiation levels, but this training was inadequate. The meat of different radiation levels was mixed up. The KGB had to be sent to the factories to ensure only high-quality meat was sent to Moscow and Leningrad. But an even bigger problem was what to do with the meat with high levels of radiation. A large portion of the produce fell into this category, and the destroying of the meat wasn't an option. The plan originally was to store this contaminated meat in freezers until the radiation levels had decreased, but the radioactive material was made up of atoms with long half-lives. The meat would remain radioactive for the foreseeable future. Processing plants quickly ran out of freezer space. They appealed to Moscow for assistance but received nothing. One plant in Belarus came up with a new way to get rid of the problem. 300 tons of radioactive meat was packed into refrigerated train cars and sent to Georgia. When it arrived, railway workers realized the danger and refused to accept the shipment. The radioactive meat train was sent from town to town across the western USSR spreading radioactive dust in its wake. Nobody wanted the meat. Nobody had the facilities to store it properly. Eventually, it was sent to a small Ukrainian town just outside the exclusion zone. Here, the carriages were abandoned. The refrigeration system stopped working, and nobody wanted to risk their lives to fix the issue. It wouldn't be until 1990 that KGB officers were finally sent to deal with the disturbing vehicle, which had spread radioactive dust across the western USSR. The carriages were taken into the exclusion zone where they were buried, finally ending this disturbing Chernobyl story. Number 1. It's not surprising that the main source of employment for the people of Pripyat was the neighboring nuclear power plant. But after this, the Chernobyl Jupiter factory was the second largest source of employment. Before April 1986, roughly 3,500 people were employed at the factory, but just what they were doing there remains a mystery. The factory opened in 1980. Pripyat was home to many university-educated people, so the location was chosen to make use of this resource. Officially, it was part of the Mayak company. The Ukrainian company is still in operation today and specializes in making communication and sound equipment. Jupiter's focus was on making cassette recorders and other household appliances. Jupiter radio equipment was popular in the Soviet Union, and this factory was supposedly designed to help meet that demand. It's debated whether any cassette recorders ever actually left the facility. Security surrounding the factory was a lot for somewhere that made simple home appliances. Entrance and exit was only through a single checkpoint. Even though the facility was made up of several buildings, they were all connected. Workers wouldn't need to go outside to go from one area to another. The roof of the complex stretches for several acres, but most workers would be confined to one small part of the facility. It is unknown just how much the people of Pripyat knew about the factory on the outskirts of the city, but today it's known that the cassette factory was just a front for a more secretive operation. The main products of the Jupiter factory were for military purposes, but even decades after the factory closed its doors, what exactly was constructed here remains a mystery. The most common theory suggests it created semiconductors for military equipment. Some believe it made black boxes used in aircraft, or possibly even for rockets. Another theory suggested that the facility had closer ties to the nuclear power plant than it first seems. According to this theory, nuclear waste would be transported from the power plant to the factory, where it would be refined for the use in nuclear weapons. But this is unlikely. The factory wasn't nearly big enough for this kind of operation, and the Soviet Union preferred to build these kind of facilities in more remote locations, away from big cities like Pripyat and far away from its western border. Whatever was being made at Jupiter, everything changed on April 26, 1986. The factory is well within the exclusion zone and was evacuated with the rest of Pripyat after the nuclear disaster. But unlike the rest of the city, it wouldn't remain abandoned for long. In 1987, work resumed at Jupiter. The focus of the complex had changed. Instead of tape recorders and whatever secret government work the factory had been producing, it instead worked on robots, which were used in the cleanup effort. The fact that the building was already highly contaminated by radiation meant it was better for testing the robots than other factories. It wouldn't be abandoned for good until 1996. Even on official tours, access to the Jupiter factory is restricted, but that hasn't stopped some people from trying to explore this mysterious site, and what they found has puzzled outsiders. The basement of the factory is a flooded laboratory, still filled with chemicals that were being used for some kind of experiment. Most mysterious are bags of gray or black powder. These are far more radioactive than the surrounding areas, with levels closer to those found inside the power plant itself. Mass spectrometers have revealed that they contained elements found inside the reactor, including plutonium, caesium-131, and strontium-90. Located nearby are bags of soil, labeled as different regions of the exclusion zone. What exactly these bags of powder are is a mystery. Some believe that these were used in an experiment to test methods of cleaning up radioactive material. Others believe it may be evidence of something much more sinister. It's unlikely we will ever get the truth behind this strange secret. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.